This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're joined today by a very distinguished guest. She is the Canada Research Chair and Professor of Gender and Islamic Studies at the University of British Columbia. In 2018, she was named Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellow and is a member of the Royal Society of Canada. She's the author of Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition. Her research focuses on religion, law, and social justice. So today we're going to talk to her about her latest book. It's her memoir, and it's about how blending our various identities can help us find our true self. That new book is entitled The Color of God, and we're happy to have with us on Make It Plain today, Ayesha Chaudhry. Ayesha, welcome to Make It Plain. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
It's an honor to have you. And by the way, folks, she is in Canada right now. So this is your memoir, correct?
That's such a funny title for the book. It's like, I think when I got into the publication process, they asked me what the book was, and I said it was a book of embodied theory, which is how I was thinking about it when I was writing it. But there's no section in the bookstore, I think, for embodied theory. So they were like, well, it's personal essays, it's memoir. And so that's what it's filed under memoir. Okay. But I didn't really write it to tell the story of my life. I tell the stories to make arguments.
I see.
Yeah.
So you were raised a Muslim, is that correct?
That's right. I was born in Toronto, raised by Muslim parents. Uh-huh.
And so the timing is interesting because we're in the season of Ramadan, are we not?
We are.
Yeah. But if I understand correctly, your upbringing in Islam was also related to something else going on simultaneously. You and your family were dealing with racism?
Right. So my parents migrated to Canada in the late 60s, early 70s, and they were from Pakistan.
That's what I thought. Okay, right.
From Pakistan, right. And, from Pakistan, so Pakistan was formed in 1947. So partition plays a very important role in the story of my family and in my self-understanding. So my father himself actually migrated from India to Pakistan with partition. And then my mother was born in Pakistan. But they were only in Pakistan for a few years, maybe less than 20 years before they moved to Canada. And when they came to Canada, they took a very assimilationist approach to being in Canada. So my father was a welder, a blue collar worker. He was a welder and a pipe fitter. And my mother was, a stay-at-home mom, having the children and raising them. And they really tried for the first decade or so that they were in Canada to assimilate to to become Canadian. And they had this experience in Canada that I think a lot of people of color do when they come to a country that practices white supremacy, which is that they discover that they are not white. And so that's a really shocking, it's a shocking experience, I think, for a lot of people. And we don't talk about it as much, about the kind of repercussions that has in their lives. So my parents, after trying to assimilate and understanding slowly over the years that they would never be white, and so they would never fit a particular image of a Canadian, we're sort of negotiating this very complicated train from a low class on the social hierarchy. And my father at one point happened to go to a Friday prayer. He was not a very religious man, and he went to a mosque that used to be a church that was converted into a mosque, which I think the architectural symbolism of that is really important as well. And there was a preacher there who was preaching that Friday. He had come from Pakistan, and he was preaching, a post-partition nationalist version of Islam that was influenced by Saudi Wahhabi ideas of Puritanism. And basically in his sermon, he preached a form of Islam that made my father feel like he could be something else. He could be someone else, that he could find meaning in a grander historical cosmological narrative where he could be important and valued. And so the form of Islam he was preaching was very compelling for him, and then later very compelling for my mother as well. So they both joined this preacher's, what I call, as a religious studies scholar, a cult. It was a small form of Islam, like a small sect of Islam. A cult is like a better word for it. That's a word I use. You took an oath of allegiance on the hand of this man. You tied wealth to him, and you joined a chapter which was called an usra, which is a family. So it was a very puritanical version of Islam that my parents joined, and they joined the year I was born. So I was almost, so they encountered this form of Islam in Canada, not in Pakistan. And they found it compelling in Canada and not in Pakistan. And so I came to be raised in a family, in a household that had this, with the zealousness of a newly converted household, even though they were basically converting from one form of Islam to another form of Islam.
And so, I mean, obviously, what should I mean, I think many of us take cult, their terminology, to be pejorative. Right. Yeah.
Well, that's a good...
Well, talk to us about that and your family's experience with that. Was this a more positive or a more negative experience?
Well, I think that when I say cult, I mean to say that it's not mainstream Islam. So it's not like it's not representative of like how most Muslims are raised. It's a very small group. It had a very particular vision for what a good Muslim looked like, what the purpose of Muslims on earth was. It had a whole philosophy behind it that was based on this cult leader's ideas. So I think of cult in that way. I'm not thinking of it necessarily pejoratively, but it's a very particular narrow understanding of Islam that is very puritanical, in which, you're like the people that are in it are saved and are on the right path, and everyone else is not following the right path. They're misguided in one way or another. So I was raised in this organization, basically, that was, I think from the outside, many people would find really, in this political climate, would find maybe, I don't know, I think the word that I think that people would find that I don't even want to say is scary. But, and it was in the time where, during my lifetime where there was the Iraq War and then the Afghan War, and demonizing Muslims is part of the political rhetoric of the countries that we were living in. But I was being raised by these people who were fundamentalist Muslims, and they were proud to use that term fundamentalism to describe themselves. The cult leader very much, espoused that term proudly, because he said that we were returning to the fundamentals of Islam, and what was wrong with that. And I was raised by these people that I loved, and by whom I was loved. And so it was not a terrifying place for me to be at all. And so that's why I think it's a unique entry into the conversation about identity and Islamophobia and race when we think about citizenship.
Well, let's get into that then. So how did that help you and your family cope with Islamophobia and racism? Was being a part of this sect helpful in that regard?
Well, great question. So my parents, when they were sort of encountering racism, and they were really upset about it, and it was traumatic for them. And they were also understanding that they could not control that, because you can't change the color of your skin. So I think in the reason this vision of Islam was compelling for them was that it basically allowed them to gain control over the experience that they were having. So if they joined this organization and they dressed a certain way, my father grew out his beard to the length of a fist. My mother started wearing hijab. If they did all of this stuff, then when people saw them, they would maybe mock them or deride them for the way they looked, the way they were dressed. So for their religious beliefs instead of the color of their skin. And I think that gave my parents a sense of control over their persecution. They felt like every time they faced a traumatic incident around being othered, they felt like it was basically they were getting martyr points, they were getting virtue points that were being deposited in their bank account. This was noble. Their struggle and their suffering was noble, instead of just really inequitable and sad. So it gave them a sense, I think, a meaning, a purpose in their persecution. And that's why I think it was very compelling for them.
Yeah. More MIP after this message. So they found sort of a way, as those of us in historically oppressed always do, to maybe even either compartmentalize or choose what box of phobia they're going to check
against,
be it religion or the color of our skin or nationality. 'Cause I mean, when you
Right.
think about it. So we're talking about your parents.
Mhm.
We're looking at what 2 or 3 boxes checked. You got religion.
Right.
You've got skin color. You got race. You got nationality.
Yeah.
So I mean, it
And
was.
class.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
class two. So
Right.
anybody in Canada could just any man check any box.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, but you're saying so what the religion allowed them to do, it gave them, if I understand you correctly, it gave them room to feel noble
Mhm.
or worthwhile in the persecution. It was persecution for a worthy cause and for their faith, correct?
Right. Yeah. And I see it almost like a shield from racism. The hyper performing the Islamic identity became a kind of shield from racism. And I think that in the lives of, in my life anyways, because I also hyper performed my religious identity for most of my life, being raised in that house. So I wore hijab since I was 5. And I wore niqab, a face veil, for 10 years, from grade 10 to the end of my master's. So being like living in Canada, going to public school, going to public university, in those, like wearing hijab and niqab, I think that what they meant to do like worked, because I actually didn't fully become aware of my racial identity until I stopped wearing hijab. And I was like, oh, I at some place in my brain, I just always thought, like, the problem, people hated Islam. And then when I stopped wearing hijab, I was like, oh, I'm brown. So I think in a way it came full circle. Like, I think with the strategy that they adopted actually did shield us growing up as like the children from, even though now I understand that Islamophobia is racialized and the racial element of that was always present. I mean, I think when I encountered othering, I definitely felt it was because of religion and not because of my race. And I felt, empowered in that way because I was choosing to dress this way and I could choose not to.
So would you say that is somewhat commonplace, that many will think that whatever discrimination that they're feeling is because of their faith or being Muslim, and that many others use that as a shield and maybe don't acknowledge the racial or the skin color implication?
I mean, I wonder if that's true for other people. I think what's interesting, I'm sure it's true in the case of some people, but I feel like what's interesting about discrimination and trauma that's associated with that is that humans are so complicated, and we are, we don't do things in a straightforward way. And I have this line in the book where I talk about humans being leaky, like we don't fit into a box. So we don't experience trauma or discrimination like the trauma associated with discrimination in a straightforward or linear way. So you actually never know how someone's going to respond to discrimination. Some people will, maybe they'll find a way to assert control through like an eating disorder. Some people might find a way to do that by hyper-performing their religious identity. Some people might do that, respond by becoming more radicalized. There's so many different ways that people respond to discrimination. And I think that's a question I really wanted to raise in the book for my readers to think about. What are the ways in which, if they are experiencing discrimination, what are the ways that they're trying to fight control over that in their life? And how is that being expressed in maybe unintentional ways?
Would you say it's healthy or unhealthy either way?
Well, I think it's a toxic situation, right? Like, discrimination is so horrible. It basically makes you feel like you're not worthy as a human being, that you have less worth, that you're inherently problematic. So I think because it comes from a toxic place, I don't think, I don't know what a healthy response to that would look like. I think it's important to ask the question, but I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to come up with every different way you can think of not to get burned by the flame. The flame is still coming.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, maybe there are 10 different ways to shield yourself, but you're right. You're still having to react to the toxic situation, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. The situation is fundamentally unhealthy that you're already in. So, and in this book, I think I sort of trace the ways in which my parents, they take this identity, and then I just really trace the ways that moves through my life and how it affects major moments in my life and what are the impacts that it has. And I try to do it in a way that really tries to hold the fullness of the humanity of all of the characters involved, but at the same time, looks critically at the consequences of that. Hence my argument about it being a book of embodied theory, where I'm thinking about these issues, of like citizenship and belong, the ways that we have of belonging, of shaping the world that shapes us. But we're doing that, we're thinking about citizenship, and we try to be citizens of a nation state. We try to belong to our families. We try to belong to our religions. We try to create a sense of we that is always changing. But I'm curious about what are the violences that we do as we try to belong to these different that we are always making up and that are always fluctuating as we move through the world.
So you clearly are not wearing hijab nor a veil currently. Talk to us about that. So where are you with that sect or that cult of Islam your parents and were involved in, you were raised in? Where are you with that now?
Well, I'm not in it anymore. I'm Muslim, but I'm not part of that particular organization, and nor are my parents, actually. They sort of like over the years softened their stances, as I think age does that to people. It softens them sometimes, not all the time. So I'm not in it anymore, and I don't feel like wearing hijab or niqab is an essential part of what it means to be a Muslim, or it's not the kind of ideal femininity that I necessarily espouse. But I very much feel strongly that, the state and really no one should intervene in women's choices, sartorial choices about how they express whatever it is that they wear, for whatever reason it is that they wear what they wear. So I support women's choice to wear what they want to. But that was one of the interesting things in the book, actually, is that I noticed only after I had written the book and it was in print that I actually didn't have like an unveiling story. And I'm really glad I didn't, but I also almost didn't. I think because I was trying to write the story, I was thinking about a Muslim audience. I was thinking about young Muslim women. I was thinking about people in diaspora. I was thinking of people who are minorities in white supremacist nation states. That story didn't feel like an important story, and it just never came up. And I really love that now in retrospect, even though I don't think I intended to do that. So
you love it now. Help me understand why. Why do you love it now that you didn't include that, or you didn't have an unveiling story?
Because I think that's, one of the things that I'm really curious about are what are the questions that we have about ourselves that are actually our own questions and come from within us? And what are the questions that we often find ourselves engaging in that are questions that are imposed on us from outside, from an external white gaze? And it feels to me like that's more a question that is interesting to a white gaze that was not actually interesting to me at all. And I know that because even without meaning to, I never ended up having that story I just didn't end up having that story in the book. It wasn't like the biggest moment, most important, moment for me to explore. And so that's why I'm sort of, I think that's why it pleases me.
Yeah, I got you. But I do have to ask though, in the experience you and your family had, and it doesn't have to be, I'm just asking, were you also in that branch of Islam dealing with issues of sexism at all? Yes,
and I talk about that in the book, actually. I talk about patriarchy is pervasive and it's all over the world, and nobody has a special claim to it, that it's, it's very complex, it's sophisticated, it changes form, and it's about a difference of degree, not of like it's existing or not. So I do very much in the book talk about the kind of patriarchal structures that I encounter like in a secular nation state, but I also talk about the kinds of patriarchal structures and teachings that I face within the Islamic tradition, whether I'm thinking about like the particular cult that I'm raised in and the kinds of ideas of like ideal femininity that are promulgated, but also in sort of like more mainstream conversation. So when I was thinking, the first book that I wrote is called Domestic Violence in the Islamic Tradition. It's basically an intellectual history of a particular verse in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 34, that has been interpreted and carries on being interpreted in the laws of some nation states to permit husbands to hit their wives. That's like very much an interest that I have in terms of how does patriarchy express itself in the law, in our theology, and also in our understandings of the nation state and capitalism and what women's labor is worth. So sort of connecting all of those to each other and showing how in a lot of these oppressive structures, we're more similar than we are different.
So, Ayesha Chaudhry, what is the color of God?
I think the point of the book is, I think if you read the book, that question goes away. But the phrase comes from a verse in the Quran that says, the color of God, and what is more beautiful than the color of God? And I think theologically, that's a really interesting, it's a verse that I have always loved. When I first read it, I just felt it was so poetic, it was so philosophical. And I think it's a really beautiful verse, I think now that I've studied hermeneutics also, because it's a phrase that you cannot read without filling in details. So without thinking about, does God have a color? What is color? What could God's color be? So it forces our brain to fill in details. And I think in doing that, it helps us learn something about ourselves. Like, what do we believe about God? What if God had a color? What color would that be? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by color? Is color like a way of life? Is color a hue? Is it like an ethic? So it raises all of these questions. So I really love that verse. And more directly related to the book, the color of God, Sabwatullah is the Arabic word that's in the Quran, was the name of my nephew who passed away suddenly. And so the book is actually named after him. And the story of his passing forms the first part and the last part of the book. And his passing was a deeply traumatic experience, of course, for my family. It happened suddenly. He was 4.5 years old. And it basically brought me to a crisis of faith and made me question. It made me wonder about what it is that I really believed. Like, I thought I believed a whole number of things, but once he passed, I realized I wasn't sure I believed in them anymore, or I didn't believe in them in the way that I thought I had believed in them. And so it forced me to go back and reconsider and re-examine a lot of the assumptions that I had been living with in an unreflective way until that point in my life. And so the middle section of the book is basically me doing that with him, with his storybook ending the journey.
More MIP after this message. So what is it that you most like readers to get from your story and your experience? What questions would you like to have the rest of us consider?
Right. Well, I think, often like the book is asking these big questions about the meaning of life, about what happens after we die. It's asking questions about how do we belong in our families, in the nation state as citizens? How do we belong in our families as well? And these are questions I think that, when like a white person asks that question, or when they think about this stuff, it feels like there's an expectation that their experience or their opinions will have universal implications. And it's, like we can all read Catcher in the Rye and get something from that, or connect in one way or another to the characters therein, or Shakespeare, or Virginia Woolf, or whoever you can name a number of people. And I think that usually when people of color, and this is not always, but usually when they are also asking the same questions, they usually have to be like big figures, political figures, philosophers, scholars, in order to be able to ask questions that might have universal relevance. And I think that a voice that we don't often hear from as having universal implications is the voice of a Muslim woman, actually. And so I think, that's one of the many voices that we don't often hear about as having ideas or opinions or experiences that might have universal implications. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was create a space for us to have these deeper conversations that we could all connect with, but through a lens that we're not used to having those conversations with. And part of why I want to do that is to help us see ourselves in a new light, but also to encourage others to see that their own lens, even if it feels niche or immediate to them, would have implications and universal implications for all of us. So I really want to make space for people to feel like their stories are important to tell, that their experiences are worth deep analysis, and that we can all learn from hearing from more and more perspectives and being exposed to more lenses in that way. And in that way, I feel like, Claudia Rankine's work, by the way, is like one of the scholars who I think she does that so brilliantly in her work, where she has an experience, she pays attention to it, she shows us that our experiences are worth paying attention to, and that they're worth analyzing, and that if we really delve deep into them, we can come up with truths that many people can connect to that might not be immediately in our particular experience.
Yeah, that's actually beautiful itself, what you're saying.
You.
Frankly,
Thank you.
Celebrity and whiteness should not predetermine relevance.
Right.
And that's a battle some of us fight every day. Just anecdotally, I was talking to, as I often do, talking to a group of activists and organizers in Delaware. Delaware has no locally, shall we say, station media. Their television and news media is based out of Philly and New Jersey and Maryland. Okay. So as a result, when we hear all the stories about the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors and the Ma'Khia Bryants and Daunte Wrights, we don't hear about those in Delaware because there's no real local television market. so to speak.
Wow.
And they share some compelling information with me, basically, that proves that the current president of the United States' home state is in and of itself is a police state. Police
Wow.
killings that go unreported. And they asked me, it's almost as if you were there, Ayesha. They asked me, they said, Reverend Mark, how do we get not only coverage for Delaware, but get people to see it and pay attention to it?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to, who decides what is most relevant to be heard,
right,
and to be seen. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you said is very important. That is his own struggle. We have to figure out ways for your story to be heard as it is in the book, and for other stories to be heard as well, that may end up being liberating for all of us, and not just presume that just because one person has a certain status or is white,
right,
but even the non-white person with
Mm-hmm.
a certain number of Twitter followers, it's as if what
right,
they say is more important
Mm-hmm.
than the stories of others. I mean, I think that's what
Mm-hmm.
you're saying, and that's why I'm saying it's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's all these like systemic reasons for why we don't get to hear those stories, as you're explaining in your experience with Delaware. And so like, there's no easy answer around, there's no easy way to think about it. But I think the more voices that we can get out there, however we do it, like, for example, through your radio show, the more space, there is even in our imaginations of ourselves for what kinds of futures are possible.
Right. And we also know that in terms of all the boxes we described, even your family alone could check. We wouldn't get the boxes my family check. Let's just deal with yours. We put both these families together, we've got about 20 boxes. But everything that relates to those boxes and puts us in a position of discrimination, oppression, everything else, and Islamophobia has now been exacerbated by obviously the last leader of the free world we just expelled from America, and his following, exacerbated by a social media climate that encourages hate and racism and discrimination. So, I mean, I think what you've done is more timely than ever, to have these conversations and to have this period of reflection.
Right. And it's one of the challenges that I was thinking about in the book as I was writing it is that, we live in this world is shaped by all kinds of systemic oppressions, racism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, capitalism is like a huge problem. And so we have all of these things that we live with, and yet, our lives cannot be reduced to those systems of oppression. We have lives that are so much more richer and more complex and nuanced and so much fuller than what any of these oppressive systems can capture. And so I think I was trying to really, pay attention to the ways that those structures were affecting my life, but at the same time, how I was living a full, beautiful life in the middle of all of that. Sometimes I think the impulse is to define ourselves by the oppression that we experience. And I think it's so important to pay attention to those structures of inequality. But I am really curious about what's left and who we are when those systems leave the room, when patriarchy leaves the room, or when whiteness leaves the room. Who are we? And so that's a question that I'm really curious about as well in relation to that.
Who are we and what defines us?
Right.
And all of that.
Right. And Saadia Hartman has that question of we, like in her book, Lose Your Mother, where she's like, has this incredible journey and, really destabilizes the notion of what the we is and how ephemeral the we is and how it's always being formed and reformed.
Yeah.
I'm
sure your students are blessed to have you.
Thank
You all take on these kinds of questions.
We do. It's really wonderful.
I bet it is. Well, it's been a pleasure hearing about you and hearing your story. Folks, check out the book, The Color of God, newly released by Ayesha Chaudhry. And there will probably be some questions you can answer for yourselves, and by doing so, answer for all of us what is left. You've even challenged me, because now I begin to wonder how much of what I do every day is defined by what's going on outside and what's going on with my oppression as opposed to what I'm able to carve out in my own definition. So yeah, that's challenging.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So you done your job with this student. Clearly I'm too old to be one of your students, but yet I still am. Ayesha Chaudhry, folks, The Color of God. Do check it out. Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.